Well, I was sitting in Dublin Airport last summer, and I had 4.5 hours to kill. Bought a cup of coffee, and I got out my iPad, and after scanning the news and the sports apps for a while, well, mostly the sports apps, I proceeded to Netflix. And it was then that I started to watch the show named Poldark. And Poldark is a British period drama set in Cornwall in the late 18th century. It's sometimes shown on PBS. I watched an episode of it this week, actually. It's in the middle of season 3. And Captain Ross Poldark is bent on freeing his friend, Dr. Dwight Ennis, who is in a French prison. Britain and France were at war, and Ennis was in a French prison. He'd been captured, and he was facing a certain death. Well, the Poldark name, according to this story, was an old family name in Cornwall. And the Poldarks had been wealthy and lived among the aristocracy. The name still carried weight at this time, but they were no longer a very wealthy family. Nonetheless, there was this up-and-comer, new money guy, George Warlegan, and he just lived in envy of Ross Poldark and the Poldark name. He longed to be a part of the aristocracy, to be looked up to, and he was always making moves to put Poldark down and raise his own profile. Well, there was this gathering of the well-to-do, and the word got out about Poldark's rescue attempt of Ennis, and as well as a possibility that Poldark might be considered for a member of the British Parliament. But the rescue mission's underway, so Poldark's gone, and Warlegan sees his chance to speak ill of him. And the ranking member of the aristocracy was at this gathering, ranking member in this place, Lord Falmouth, and at this gathering, Warlegan talks about Poldark's foolhardy efforts. Who in their right mind, in their late 30s, with a wife and children at home, a family that needs provision and protection, would venture off to France at a time of war on such an ill-founded mission? And how can such a small group, he went with half a dozen others, how can such a small group possibly infiltrate a well-guarded French prisoner of war compound? Surely a man of such poor judgment should never represent the people of Cornwall at Westminster. Lord Falmouth glared at him and walked away. What Warlegan didn't know was that Lord Falmouth's nephew had also been captured and was in a French prison. And as things turned out, Poldark freed Dr. Ennis and 20 other British prisoners, including, although he wasn't aware of the connection at the time, this nephew of Lord Falmouth. And unaware of this connection personally, Poldark brings these two men home, and they both verbalized how much they were in Poldark's debt, and Poldark's name in the midst of the aristocracy in Cornwall went up, and poor George Warlegan went to where his name should have been. But if you think about it for a moment, what Warlegan said, the wisdom of George Warlegan was not that bad by most people's standards. Poldark's mission was foolhardy. He was risking his life. He could have left his wife and children destitute in that era when there were no social programs to fall back on. Much better to stay at home and protect one's own and Let Ennis figure his own way out of this prison. But crazy as it seemed, Poldark's mission, his expedition, had a wisdom. It was a different kind of wisdom to it, because Poldark and Ennis had been friends for a long time. Ennis had once saved Poldark's life. Ennis had kept him out of a debtor's prison on one occasion. And the bond between these two men was extraordinary. And it was such that it drove Poldark, crazy as this mission was, risky as this mission was, he went. There was this wisdom of another kind that drove him. It was something deep in his heart and his mind, and this friendship that he had for Dwight Ennis. Now, let's get back to Corinthians. In Paul's letter to the Corinthians, as we talked about last time, after Paul had his mission there were others who followed, other apostles. Apollos was one of them. And he conveyed a gospel that it was perhaps deeper, more theologically astute, more mystical than Paul's gospel. And the church divided with all these presentations of the gospel. And there were some Corinthians that said, I follow Apollos. And there were some Corinthians that said, I follow Peter. There were some said, I follow Paul. And some said, I follow Christ. And Paul, immediately, he's in this situation in this letter where he's having to defend not only the unity of the church, but the gospel that he had given to them. And he says it had to be simple, because I was the first bearer of the good news. You were having to learn about Jesus in a basic form. But more than just that, this message itself, he says, you must realize, is out of sorts with higher forms of wisdom, and particularly the wisdom of the world. To the world, the Christian gospel is crazy. Doesn't fit. The cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, says Paul. But there is a wisdom of a different kind, wisdom of God. And we see how out of sorts this gospel is with the thought of the great thinkers of the world. If you take, for instance, one of the greatest philosophers of the 19th century, Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche wrote against Christianity quite a number of times, and in one of his writings he said, when we hear the ancient bells growling on a Sunday morning, we must ask ourselves, is it really possible? Is it really possible for a Jew crucified 2,000 years ago to be God's son? He says the proof of that is lacking, and is lacking in so many of its assertions, Christianity. It's hard to think that such things are still to be believed. And Nietzsche went on to say much more about the Christian faith, including, in German, Gott ist tot. God is dead. And Nietzsche, beyond that, was a nihilist, and he viewed life as having no objective purpose, no meaning, no value, no standard of morality. And there's some suggestion that this nihilism actually led to the madness that eventually took his life in 1900. What's the point of living if there's no point? And Nietzsche's not alone in questioning. There are others. Other bright minds have joined in this chorus and questioned the Christian faith. And the world, even in this age, looks on Christianity generally with ambivalence. Even in our liberal society, claims so much toleration, bring up sort of a serious Christian viewpoint, and it's often met with a wry smile or a roll of the collective eye. We proclaim Christ crucified, says Paul, a stumbling block to the Jews, foolishness to the Gentiles, But God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, God's weakness stronger than human strength. Paul points us to a wisdom of a different kind. Now, there were passages like this one that led to a kind of anti-intellectualism in the church. My father was actually one of 13 children, and he was the only one to go on to higher education. And as I look back on it, my aunts and my uncles, lovely people, they were kind of simple folk, and they mostly eked out an existence through the sea and the fishing industry that gave life to their village. My Aunt Marianne, a dear, dear, dear soul, and the Christian life that she learned in Sunday school and every week as she attended church, that governed her life. And hers was a very simple faith, but an effective one. She just loved us all. And I think it was the last time that I saw my Aunt Marianne. I knocked on her door, walked in. She had this dimly lit cottage. And there she was as I'm entering, sitting in her armchair, Bible in hand, reading under a table lamp. And she held the Bible in her lap as we chatted for a while. And she talked about my father, who had died at a very young age, and she talked about him driving lorries. That's trucks, for those of you who haven't been on the other side of the big pond. But driving lorries up and down the harbor, and how she was always worried about him, that he would go over the edge and fall into the harbor. And she told me about him coming to faith at a mission service at the Methodist church nearby. And then how she worried when he went off to Cliff College and then to Edge Hill College at Queen's University in Belfast. She was so worried about him that he was going to lose his faith to book learning. And she said she prayed and she prayed and she prayed that he would remain faithful. And I think she was saying something to me in this discussion, because at the time I was at theology school at the University of St. Andrews. But book learning, it was a big concern for people of my aunt's generation, and they had heard some preachers using passages like this in 1 Corinthians about the wisdom of the world and the dangers of education and the ability of the world's wisdom to shipwreck a person's faith. A couple of years later, I was doing graduate work at Laurier, now over in Canada, and I met Ben. Ben was a Pentecostal, and he was doing graduate work there as well. And as I got to know him, I was surprised because he was so evangelical and conservative in his theology. And I was surprised because Laurier's Department of Religion was not exactly a conservative place to be. And as the year went on, Ben had questions. And the questions came hard and fast. And I remember the group of graduate studies, we had a gathering towards the end of that academic year. And in that, Ben announced that he had become an atheist. Didn't believe anything anymore. And that was it for him with the study of religion. He was going to finish the year, but he was going to go and do something else. And I tried to talk to him, but it had all become foolishness to Ben. And I had other friends went the same way. Book learning. Now, I won't speak about book learning. I've done an awful lot of it myself. I won't speak ill of it. But it was certainly a concern in my aunt's age, and it has led to Ben and many others losing faith. A couple of years later, again, I had my own dark nights of the soul that went on for months and months and months. Questioned everything. Critical material that I was reading and theological school and studying biblical studies. Wasn't exactly faith-building. And for a couple of years, I questioned and questioned and questioned, and I'm not sure that I answered all the big questions that I had, as much as I came to terms with the notion that we will never be able to answer all of life's questions. And the human mind is finite. And no other faith or worldview has all the answers either. But those are rational thoughts. And it wasn't those rational thoughts that kept me in the faith, but something else. And the thing that kept me in was this. It related to what had happened to me in my early 20s when I came to faith in the first place. It changed my life. And the change was so significant that I could only put it down to the work of God. I tried to fit it into other things, is this a psychological thing that you're going through and all that? But I couldn't. I had absolutely no interest in the church at the time. But change happened. I could only put it down to God. And it was something I experienced in my heart. Something affected my mind and my heart. And it was like a wisdom of another kind came and brought Christ and the work of the cross and the love of God in here. And you remember going back to Ross Poldark and that story? He moved beyond what was probably wise in the world, what was safe, in favor of something he felt in his heart and his soul for this friend. And here with me, it was not intellectual answers to problems. It was a wisdom of another kind, something, an experience. And if you think about the Apostle Paul, he's out persecuting the church. But then one day, this event that had happened a few years earlier at Calvary became real for him. He was on the road to Damascus, and the risen Christ appears to him, and suddenly all these things begin to make sense. Another kind of wisdom, and it gave him such faith that he would say, whether he lived or died, it didn't matter. He was going to be with Christ. And he says, it's foolishness to the world. But God chose the foolishness of the world to shame the wise and the powerful and the noble. And God did it this way, that no one could boast except through Christ. Because Christ is our wisdom, Christ our righteousness, Christ our sanctification, Christ our redemption, he says. It's all Christ alone. We can't boast in superior knowledge to get to God or superior wisdom. We can't boast because we're people of power and get to Christ. We can't boast because we're born into nobility or whatever. It's all Christ. I think that's pretty heady stuff for the sensibilities of United Church people. Many of us question. Many of us put great value in being in tune with the world about us. Many of us don't want to be looked at with any sense of ridicule or disdain. We don't want to be lumped in with the crazies or the foolish. We want to use our minds. These things are given to us by God. They're good. But in using our minds, do we also have room for a wisdom of a different kind? The wisdom of God. A cross that was a stumbling block to the Jews, foolishness to the Gentiles. For in Christ alone, says Paul, there is life for those who believe. In Christ alone.